Hi everyone, good day. Today we are to discuss the disaster management continuum. Previously, we have learned the different types of disaster, and at this point, we are to discuss the following: the disaster management, disaster preparedness, medical and public health response, public health impacts of disaster, disaster mitigation. And all in all, we are to discuss the disaster continuum. And we'll try also to include what are the measures and what are the activities under this or under each phases of disaster continuum. So we knew that disaster occurs when hazard meets vulnerability. So there would be progression of vulnerability based on its root causes, dynamic pressures, and unsafe condition. Looking onto the image in front of you onto the left side, for the root causes, it may be coming from the limited access of the community maybe to the power, structure, and resources, and as well as ideology such as political system and economic system. For the dynamic pressures that progresses vulnerability of either an individual or a community, it starts with the lacking of local institutes, trainings for personnel, appropriate skills, local investment, local market, media freedom, and ethical standards in public life. For the macro forces may include rapid population growth, rapid urbanization, arms expenditure, debt repayments, deforestation, and decline in soil productivity. Unsafe conditions may also contribute to the progression of vulnerability, such as fragile physical environment, which may include dangerous locations, unprotected and unprotected buildings and infrastructures. For the fragile local, such as the economy, such as um, inclusion of the livelihood at risk and low income levels, vulnerability in the society, and of course, public actions, which may include lack of preparedness and endemic diseases that are present that can lead to pandemic. For the hazards, these are the ones um, that may happen around that is not being controlled, no, by any individual, such as earthquake, high winds, hurricane, typhoon, flooding, volcanic eruptions, landslide, and the others. So all of this risk and vulnerability, if prevented properly, may of course halt on the development of disasters. But if not prevented, this progression of vulnerability and hazard, it may lead to disastrous events. So last time we have discussed the classification of disaster being a natural type of disaster and a man-made. So we'll try to focus more onto the discussion on what is disaster management. So contextually, it is described as the body of policy and administrative decisions and operational activities that pertain to various stages of a disaster at all levels. It is an applied science which seeks, by systematic observation and analysis of disasters, to improve measures relating to prevention, emergency response, recovery, and of course, mitigation. It encompasses all aspects of planning for and responding to disaster, including both pre and post disaster activities. So if we will look onto the description, it does not focus only to the response on after, okay? The response after a disaster had happened, but it also include on the preparation before a disaster comes in, increasing capability of individuals, families, and community to prepare, mitigate, and respond for any disaster. It is a continuous and integrated process of planning, organizing, coordinating, and implementing measures which are necessary or expedient to the following. So we can see that it may apply the processes of leadership and management in the following: prevention of danger and threat of any disaster, reduction of risk in any disaster or its severity or consequences, capacity building, preparedness to deal with any disaster, prompt response to any threatening disaster situation, assessing the severity or magnitude of effects of any disaster, evacuation, rescue and relief, rehabilitation, and of course, reconstruction post disaster. So the following are the basic phases of an integrated disaster management. So this includes preparedness, response, recovery, and of course, mitigation. So during preparedness, it involves the activities prior to a disaster. So disaster preparedness plans are involved, emergency exercises, trainings, the drills that we usually do in the offices, in the schools, and in the communities, and of course, warning systems that may be implemented by both national and local government. For the response, so these activities are held or performed during a disaster. This may include public warning systems such as during typhoons, expected floodings, no? There would be times that you may be hearing an alarm, right? Coming from from the authorities that may indicate that individuals including families should evacuate already the locality or the vicinity. So, emergency operations and search and rescue. There would be difference between search and retrieval and search and rescue. Sometimes you may hear that during the news, right? We do search and rescue if we do expect that there may still be signs of life, okay? Or we do expect that the one that we're looking for are still living. While search and retrieval is usually done at the latter part, for example, after several days, after a week of the disaster, wherein we do not actually expect that the one we're looking for is still living. So at least we would like to retrieve the body. Okay. For the recovery, so these activities following a disaster. Temporary housing, claims processing, for example, with uh, social securities, right? The GSIS, SSS, claims processing in terms of those who were affected by the disaster, grants, and of course, medical care. During mitigation, this is one of the important phases, is that these activities that are performed to reduce the effects of the disaster. So this may include regulations such as, for example, the building codes and zoning. Zoning, if you can hear in the news, no, usually it is implemented to the flood prone areas or those living nearby the volcanoes. So you can hear 10-kilometer danger zone, 6-kilometer danger zone. Next would be vulnerability analysis. Those areas which are more vulnerable for earthquakes, more vulnerable for flash flooding, landslides, and of course, public education on what to do before, during, and after a disaster. So this is just the same as what we have discussed in the previous slide, but it would like to reiterate that the proactive strategies of the disaster management continuum involves the prevention, mitigation, and of course the preparedness, which include as or can be umbrellaed as capacity building activities for both individual, family, and local community. Reconstruction involves rehabilitation, which is necessary for recovery, such as immediate relief during or post disaster. So we'll try to discuss each of the phases of the disaster management. You can see here in that there is an additional phase. All right. So it starts with the disaster preparedness, disaster impact, disaster response, disaster recovery, and of course, disaster mitigation. When we do say preparedness as the first phase, it is ongoing multi-sectoral activity. All right. I would like to reiterate it's ongoing. So, meaning it is continually done by the local authorities. Integral part of the national system, responsible for developing plans and programs for the following: disaster management, prevention, mitigation, response, rehabilitation, and construction. We know that nationally it is spearheaded by the NDRRMC, or the National Disaster and Risk Reduction Council. So this NDRRMC branched out up to the smallest of our community. So from the national going to the regional disaster risk reduction to the municipal, or either municipal or the city, then of course to each barangay level. It may include coordination of a variety of sectors to carry out the following: evaluation of the risk of each community, adopt standards and regulations, organize communication and response mechanism so that people may be informed of who to contact and what to do and when to dispatch things. Ensure all resources are ready and easily mobilized. Develop public education programs. Coordinate information with news media. Sometimes they may have to appoint a representative who to represent them in media relations and to public speaking, and disaster simulation exercises. These were the ones, for example, usually done in the NCR, that will be having a mass fire drill, a mass earthquake drill, right? If you can remember, we do involve in this kind of activities. Medical preparedness and mass casualty management involves developing and capacity building of medical team for trauma and psychosocial care. You see that disaster preparedness and response does not focus only to the physical being of an individual that may be involved in it, but also the psychosocial part. Determine casualty handling capacity of all hospitals nearby so that we may know where to send our patients or victims during a disaster, if they can still handle, and if the hospital bed capacity is truly capable of managing and housing the individuals being affected of the disaster. Formulate appropriate treatment procedures, involvement of course, private hospitals. There are more private hospitals than of government hospitals. So we can also send patients to them as long as we do coordinate properly. Mark would be care centers that can function as a medical unit and identify structural integrity and approaches routes. Second phase would now be disaster response. So it is now the time where the disaster is already present or existing. Immediate reaction to disaster, as a disaster is anticipated or soon after it begins, or in order to assess the needs, reduce the suffering, limit the spread and consequences of it, open up a way to rehabilitation by doing the following. First, mass evacuation. Of course, we would like to lessen the casualties Okay, if you may be hearing in the news, for example, those in the areas that are in the flood prone areas, or those in the areas that may be near the volcano during an eruption. So we do evacuate these people. Search and rescue, emergency medical services, securing food and water. That's why there would be food provision, of course, to those of in the evacuation areas. Okay, we would not like to evacuate those people and just let them be on their own. Okay, baka kasi bumalik, or they may go back to the areas from where they have been evacuated. And of course, maintenance of law and order. So for the disaster impact and response, again, this may include search and rescue, first aid, field care, triaging of those part or have been afflicted by the disaster. So we have discussed already the 4 levels of triage. Later on, we'll try to review those again. Tagging of those individuals who have been triaged, and of course, identification of those who died of the disaster. So for the medical and public health response as part of disaster impact management, so for the pre-hospital emergency service, of course, when we do say pre-hospital, these are caring of individuals prior or before they have been handed off to the health facility. So linkage to government incident command system, external medical service, and extrication workers. When we do say extricate, it is removing of the victim onto the area. For example, during a mass casualty, a bus accident, no, there are individuals who are trapped inside. So extrication is the removal, and of course, search and rescue team. Assessment of immediate health needs, identification of medical and health resources, temporary field treatments. It's necessary, so that we can manage immediately those who are needed to be managed medically or physically at the disaster site before handing off to the hospital, especially those of who can be treated at the moment. So prompt and proper treatment to save lives may be instituted. This is the one that I have been talking about in terms of the triaging, which was discussed already before, right? We do have 4 levels: the high priority, medium priority, least priority, and of course, those who are dead or moribund. So they are color coded for us to easily identify. So this may include also the tagging. Later on, I can show you an example of the tagging system. So red is for the high priority, which means that these individuals may be having affected uh, by either there could be problems in their circulation, airway, and breathing. Okay, these are the ones we should attend immediately first. Second would be medium priority. So they should be attended properly immediately, but may not lead to death. The non-attendance of immediate attendance to them may not lead to immediate death. Okay, but rather um, just may lead to small malfunctioning, but still should be attended immediately. The greens are the ones considered to be ambulatory patients. So they are good to go. At times they may be affected, but a little in terms of physical, for example, a little wound or a contusion. Okay, those black or tagged as black are those dead and moribund, or the ones who may be nearing death, or they, or should I say, there is a chance or a high chance of non-survival because of the disaster. Okay, they may consider be the least priority of all the other individuals or those victims afflicted by the disaster. This is the tagging that we may utilize, no? So color coding for proper identification. And of course, we would like to take the vital signs of the patients if we can, at least name if we can, but if too much for us to get, at least we have tagged properly the patient as long as we have assessed them for proper tagging. So, in continuation of the medical and public health response from the pre-hospital, so now we then move on to the management of hazardous agent exposure. So, we would like to identify, of course, the particular matter that may have caused the injury to the individual, also infectious agents if hospitals or scientific laboratories may have been damaged. We would like to also entertain the probability of an individual having a mental health issue after a disaster. So, specialized psychological triage and treatment significant in terrorism. So, information and behavioral contagion handling and the risk communication are also necessary to be instituted for the medical and public health response. The following could be the consequences of disaster. Okay. Of course, we know that there could be a health impact to the individual. Okay. For the individual level, there could be health concerns that may arise after a disaster have happened. So physically, they may do have entanglement, injuries, disabilities, coma, or at times, saddening, but death. Okay. For the psychological, of course, cognitive, behavioral, and social concerns may arise. In the community, we may do have a structural damage to variable extent. Okay. Maybe the loss of their houses, uh, destruction of buildings, or maybe the whole barangay. For the ecological, of course, changes in the ecosystem, and of course, economically, financial losses. They may lose jobs, farmers may lose the fields that may be doing the farming that may affect their financial capabilities. So, symptoms after disaster can be classified into four: your physiological symptoms, cognitive symptoms, emotional, and of course, behavioral symptoms. Fatigue can be classified as part of the physiological symptoms. So, shocks, profuse sweating, fine motor tremors, chills, teeth grinding, muscle aches, and dizziness. So, there could be an acute or an immediate response, right? For the, if you can remember the sympathetic responses, an increase in the body, in the heart rate, increase in the blood pressure, dizziness, right? So for the cognitive symptoms, there could be memory loss, because the psyche is trying to remove uh, part that is actually traumatic. So distractibility, reduced attention span because of the heightened level of anxiety, decision making difficulties, calculation difficulties. So patients or victims may be having loss of focus and confusing trivial with major issues. For the emotional symptoms, anxiety, feeling of overwhelmed, it's too much, everything around that is happening is too much to handle. Grief at times may be caused by a loss, all right? Maybe a loss of someone they love due to death, or a loss physically, they don't know where they are, or at times loss of financial or finances and loss of their houses. So there could be different types of losses that can lead to different types of grief as well. Identification of victims, depression, anticipation of harm to self, including to others, and of course, irritability. Behavioral symptoms may include insomnia, substance abuse, gallow humors, gait, gait changes, ritualistic behavior, hypervigilance, and unwillingness to leave the specific scene. So, factors which may affect different reactions. So for the disaster-related factors, it may include lack of warning coming from the authorities, scope of the event, abrupt contrast of the scene, personal loss or injury, type of disaster that have happened, for example, even fire, no, in the community, for example, 20 to 50 houses have been burned. It can be considered as a disaster that can put or impose losses to individuals. Traumatic stimuli, nature of the destructive agent. We may also would like to entertain the possibility of human errors. Time of occurrence at night maybe, or at times that they are not prepared or they don't know what is happening around while sleeping. A lack of opportunity to effective action, and sometimes environmental such as temperature, pollution, humidity. So host related factors meaning that the individual are the ones being involved. So for the health, there could be disability or invalidity, medical problems and conditions that may put them more to risk. For the social, lack of support network, such as those who are divorced, widowed, and at times there could be cultural barriers. For example, you're coming from Manila and you've gone to the province wherein you met the disaster. Okay, there could be lacking of social support. For the demographic, the age of an individual may affect, right? If it is a school age, so understanding of what is happening around could be difficult for them. So sex, for example, more stress in women, but more considered to be more resilient, like that. And of course, past history, their previous experience with the same event or previous experience with other events, but same in terms of the hazard or the disaster being experienced. So mental illness and of course emotional problems. Diseases during disaster may also arise. This is another problems for health, right? Especially those who are with evacuation centers. So there could be epidemics during disaster. And at this point in time, during COVID-19, there is an existing pandemic, and at times disaster may be happening, just like what some individuals have experienced during the Ulysses, right? So coexisting, there is a coexisting pandemic that during that kind of specific disaster. So other than that, other problems may still arise during the evacuation period of these people. So it is considered to be part as or a consequence of a disaster. Some tend to become pandemics to evolve, such as previously, in before pa, no? About 750 AD, plague of Justinian, okay, killed about 60% of or about 100 millions of Europe's population, the Black Death, the Spanish flu, and as I've mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic today. Other than that, there could be communicable diseases after disasters. So, pre-existing diseases in the population, for example, the presence of diarrhea. All right. If someone who has dysentery, cholera in the vicinity of the evacuation center, and if they do not have a proper excreta, the disease can spread to others. So others and most of those evacuees may experience dysentery and cholera. So measles could be hardly to be contained, especially it is a it is an airborne disease. And if the evacuation areas are secluded and not well ventilated, so individuals may also be coming in contact to each other. The spread of these measles, tuberculosis could be easy. So, presence of malaria, intestinal parasites, scabies, and other skin infections. For the ecological changes, there could be altered in the ecology, such as vector-borne and water-borne diseases. So there could be, as I've mentioned, malaria, dengue, okay, living conditions, plague, louse-borne, typhus, and relapsing fever. Stray animals and wild displacement may lead to rabies. Okay? And damage to public utilities such as water supplies and sewage disposal could be also disrupted. For the population movements, introduction of new disease or vector in settlements could be diarrheal diseases, measles, viral hepatitis, whooping cough, malaria, and many others. Interruption in public health services, there could be disruption in the curative and preventive services, interrupted vector control, malaria, dengue. For interrupted immunization concerns with measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, altered individual uh, diseases, and malnutrition. Other than medical and physical health concerns, every during disaster, after disaster, there could be other public health impacts of disaster, such as sexual violence. Okay, rape, exploitation, and sexual violence can also happen. So, what could be the possible causes of this? Separation of women from the family. For example, a loss of a wife. Okay, or separation because the husband or the woman did not uh, come for evacuation. So weakened social structures could also be a possible cause of this, and increased aggressive behavior. For human right violation, such as torture of a civilian because of a rage and anger, physical and psychological harms, sexual trafficking, child labor, and denial of basic needs. For the mental health impacts of disasters, PTSD could be the most common. So post-traumatic stress disorder, during stage 1, there could be an adrenergic surge in the individual. So then a feeling or a sense of helplessness and a loss of self-control can be experienced. And at the third stage, an individual may experience this despondency and, of course, demoralization. So in children, developmental age is more important. That's why we do have to deal to them or talk to them, communicate in the level of what they can understand as an individual, as a children. Okay, so for the preschooler, there could be increase in the arousal, fear. School age children, they could be reckless, psychosomatic signs could also be present. And adolescents, some may partake in rescue and recovery, especially those who are already late adolescents. Especially they can understand what is happening in the area. However, there could be some adolescents, especially yung adolescents pa, may lead to regression and withdrawal could also be possible. For the elderly, there could be increased risk of physical injury than mental problems. So physical injury are also coming from their family members, relatives, or at times authorities. So during, before, and after, especially uh, disaster, we do not only deal with those who are victims or actual victims of the disaster, but also the ones who are doing the rescue. That's why I believe psychological first aid should not only be instituted to those victims of the disaster, but also to those of the rescuers. Since they have been seeing a lot of disastrous events, a lot of individuals who may have been impacted of this disaster. So their mental health could also be affected. Okay, so the rescuers are also considered as the secondary victims of disaster. Stress reactions are seen, especially those in non-professionals. More emotional trauma if involved in a field rescue attempts, especially if children are involved, they may have transference that they they may think of their own families while doing the search and rescue, for example. Inexperienced body handlers may become more sensitive, especially if they've been dealing with dead bodies, carcasses already. That's why August, okay, every August 19, it is observed as World Humanitarian Day in honor of aid workers who lost their lives. So we do usually celebrate annually this World Humanitarian Day. On my personal experience, when I'm still with the Red Cross, we do usually um, celebrate this one. So here are some important steps for the responders can actually take to ensure that they may do a very good job, okay, and cope with challenging situations. So when they are still preparing for a response, try to learn as much as possible about what could be their roles. Okay, what can they do? What will they do? Which is, of course, usually done. No, orientations for the rescuers. If they would be traveling or working for long hours during a disaster response, they can explain this to their loved ones, their wives, husbands, especially children's, right? So come up with ways you may be able to communicate with them, especially at this time. There are a lot of communication media, okay? Social media, phone calls, text messages. So keep their expectations realistic and take the pressure off yourself. Talk to your supervisor if you are the rescuer and establish a plan for who will fill any urgent ongoing work duties unrelated to the disaster while you are engaged in the response. So additional would be limit working alone by trying to work in teams. So at least working with a body could be helpful. Someone you can talk to, you can relate your feelings with. Responders experience stress during a crisis. When stress build up can cause, of course, burnout, is a feeling of extreme exhaustion and being overwhelmed, or at times secondary traumatic stress. Stress reactions and symptoms resulting from exposure to another individual's traumatic experience. So previously you we have mentioned the things that an individual can experience during a response, no? So at this point we'll try to discuss the coping techniques, okay? Coping techniques that they may do, such as taking breaks, eating healthy foods so that their nutrition could be good, therefore their mentation can be also be alert. Exercising it may help reduce physical stress, right, by losing the nerves, and it may also release endorphins that is considered to be happy hormones. And of course, using a body system can help prevent and reduce burnout and secondary trauma stress. So they can be someone you can talk to as a rescuer, relate your feelings with, and discuss maybe some hazy or vague areas for you. Recognize the rescuer should recognize the signs of both of these conditions within themselves and other responders to be sure those need a break or someone needs help can address their specific needs. So, how do we now recognize presence or different signs of burnout? Okay, we can say that someone may be burned out if they do feel sadness, depression, or at times apathy, no having no responses to anything at all. Okay, kumbaga they just have bland faces, blank responses, early frustration or easy frustration, blaming of others and irritability, lacking of feelings, indifferent, isolation or disconnection from others, poor self-care that may include poor hygiene. They could be feeling tired, exhausted, or at times overwhelmed. So feeling these are the following could be the feeling or the thinking of those rescuers who may be experiencing burnout. So they may think that they are a failure, especially if they do not actually uh, had a very good rescue result or outcome. Nothing that they do can help anyone, no? So s- at times these rescuers may feel or think that they are not performing well in terms of their job, and at times yan leading to substance abuse, no? Alcohol, use of drugs to be able to cope because they do think that it's their proper way to do to cope on this burnout or what they have feeling in, no, because they do not actually recognize that this is burnout that they are experiencing. So for the secondary traumatic stress, the following signs could be present: excessively worry or feel about something bad can happen, easily startled, yung biglang nagiging magugulatin, no, or always on guard of all times. Physical signs of stress such as racing heart or an increase in the heart rate, maybe high blood pressure as well. Nightmares or recurrent thoughts about traumatic situation. The feeling of others' trauma is yours or their own experience. So what to do now? So, of course, in a body system, I've mentioned earlier, no, two responders may partner together to support each other and monitor each other's stress, workload, and safety. So that's why it is actually very good to have a body. So get to know each other, talk about, um, get to know each other. They can talk about their background, their interests, hobbies, and family. So identify each other's strengths and weaknesses. Second, as a part of the body system, they should keep an eye on each other. So try to work in the same location if they can. Set up times to check in with each other since they are your bodies. They you think that they can be someone who can listen carefully and share experience and feelings, acknowledge tough situations and recognize accomplishments is very are very good practices of this body system, no, even those small triumphs can be celebrated. Offer to help with basic needs such as sharing supplies and transportation. Monitor each other's workloads. Encourage each other to, of course, take out breaks. Share opportunities for stress relief such as rest, routine, sleep, exercise, and deep breathing. So what to do now for as an individual or as a rescuer to do their own self-care? Okay. So self-care is very important, loving yourself. So limit working hours to no longer than 12-hour shift if the work actually allows. Okay? Because at times rescuers like those in the military can do nothing but to come on duty. They are on 24-hour duty, for example. Okay? What they can do is that they can talk this to their superiors. Work in teams and limit amount of time working alone. As I mentioned earlier, work in bodies. So write a journal, talk to a family member, friend, supervisor, and teammates about feelings and experiences. Uh, they can do it through social media contacts, right? Phone calls. Practice breathing and relaxation techniques. Breathing techniques actually help calming the nerves. Maintain a healthy diet and get adequate sleep and exercise. Know that it is okay to draw boundaries and say no at times to the tasks. And avoid or limit caffeine and use of alcohol because this may actually increase sympathetic responses. So it is always important to remind yourself as a rescuer, or those rescuers should remind themselves that it is not selfish to take breaks. And of course, the needs of survivors are more important than your own needs and well-being. Okay? It is not more important. It's as equal as it should be. Okay? They should be equally important. And working all of the time does not mean you will make your best contribution because you may get exhausted and performance may not that at a very good level. So take break, give time for yourself. And of course, there are other people who can help in the response. It is not only you who do the response. You are always coming in teams. So after the response, since responding to disasters can be both rewarding and stressful, knowing that you have stress and coping with actually um, will help you make stay well, and this allows you to keep helping others who are affected by the disaster. All right, so at this point, let's now go on to the next phase of disaster continuum. This which is disaster recovery. So, repatriation usually happens after the emergency is over, displaced, and people actually return to their place of origin. Rehabilitation can be done, so this may involve restoration of basic social functions such as providing temporary shelters, stress debriefing for responders, okay, responders and victims, economic rehabilitation, psychosocial rehab, and scientific damage assessment. Elements of recovery include community recovery, infrastructure recovery, economy recovery for financial and political, and of course, environmental recovery. Reconstruction is also necessary. This may include rebuildings of homes, permanently repairing and rebuilding infrastructures in the locality. So, this may involve owner-driven reconstruction. Kung kayo yung may-ari ng bahay, you reconstruct your own home. Speedy reconstruction, especially in the infrastructures that may affect transportation, communication, and of course, linking reconstruction with safe development. So, as when another calamity, for example, may come, so the risk and vulnerability actually decreases, therefore decreasing also the possibility of having another disastrous event. Next would be your disaster mitigation. So Permanent reduction of risk of a disaster to limit the impact of human suffering and economic assets is the main goal of disaster mitigation. For primary mitigation, it is about reducing hazards and vulnerability, and secondary mitigation could be reducing effects of hazard. Components include reducing the hazard and of course reducing as well their vulnerability. When we do reduce the hazard, protection against threat by removing the cause of threat is necessary. So reducing the effect of threat is the main focus of reducing the vulnerability. So we know that natural hazards are inevitable, so as well as reduce vulnerability. And the following could be the components of disaster mitigation: your hazard identification and mapping, and the vulnerability analysis, so as to reduce the vulnerability. So hazard identification includes assessment of the areas that may be affected or having at high risk of hazards, estimating probability of a damaging phenomenon of given magnitude in a given area. So considerations could be history of the what are the previous disasters have happened onto the area, what are the hazards that are present, probability of various intensities, maximum threats, and possible secondary hazards. For the vulnerability analysis, a process of which result in an understanding of the types and levels of exposure of persons, property, and of course the environment to the effects of identified hazards at a particular time. Next component of disaster mitigation would be disaster risk analysis. So determining the nature and the scale of losses which can be anticipated in a particular area. It involves analysis of the following: the probability of a hazard of a particular magnitude, elements susceptible to potential loss or damage, nature of vulnerability, and specific future time period. And of course, prevention. Okay? Prevention, these are activities that are taken to prevent a natural phenomenon or potential hazard from having harmful effects on either the people and the economic assets. The following measures could be done. It could be an active or a passive measure. Of course, an active measure is that the community is taking control, okay, or taking active actions on what to do to heal the community and later on prevent any occurrence of this disaster by reducing the hazard and vulnerability. So promotion of desired actions by doing planning control with the uh, regional and municipal or city risk reduction council, including also the barangay. Training and education of rescue personnel, not only them, but more so the community themselves, right? Capacity building, economic assistance, subsidies, okay, especially to those who are affected by the disasters. Their social securities can be utilized as part of um, disaster mitigation measure. Facilities, so refugee points, shortage should also be addressed. And of course, public information. For passive measures, these are actually prevent undesired actions, okay, by doing the following: requirement to conform with the design codes such as those in the building codes. All buildings are uh, including houses are expected to abide with the building code, okay, so as to prevent disasters at home during even maybe an earthquake or even a fire. checking compliance of controls on site. If you know, no, annually, for example, annually in a school building like our school, annually usually every March or at the first quarter, the Bureau of Fire Protection inspects the building for possible fire hazard, and as well as observe the training or observe the simulation of a fire, or di ba we call it at times fire drill, and it may be also accompanied with an earthquake drill. So this may be part of the preventive measure. So court proceedings, fines, closure orders to those institutions who do not actually comply with the requirement imposed by the building code or some regulations. Control land use, denial of utilities in areas, development, and this. So the population in the Philippines as of 2019 is more than 100 million. It's about 108 million 600,000 plus. Okay, and it is growing, continuously growing at a rate of 2% between 2015 before to 2019, and continuously growing. It is the 13th most populated country in the world, and according to the world's population review. So, yung land area natin could be, we are, of course, an archipelago. Okay? You know that we are made of about 7,000 plus islands in the country, with over about 300,000 square meters or square kilometers rather. Most of the islands were small and only few are large islands like Luzon and Mindanao. So Manila, being the capital of the Philippines, ranks first to be the most densely populated city in the world. Meaning, the land area of the city of Manila does not actually commensurate to the, or does not actually a very good number or a very good land area for the number of people that actually lives in it. Okay, and you know that we are very much populated, not only in Manila but in the whole metro Manila. So the country is prone to natural disasters. And the Philippines, as a country prone to natural disaster, described how the Philippines have suffered from a number of deadly typhoons, as we have experienced earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and other natural disasters, primarily because of its location. We know that we are part of the Ring of Fire, right? So typhoons, especially, we are open at the Pacific Ocean. So earthquakes can happen and volcanic eruption takes place. So the latest example, oh, ito lang, the Ulysses might be the latest. So including also the eruption of what do you call the volcano in Batangas, the Taal volcano, right? Before the COVID-19 pandemic actually hit us. Okay? There is not actually a big earthquake, rather the the ashes coming from it affected a lot even up to Metro Manila. Okay? So why is the Philippines so disaster prone? So we've mentioned that we are greatly exposed to the Pacific Ocean. We are part of the Ring of Fire, and technically first we, because of the warm ocean waters, because we are a tropical country, we are in the equator where the sun is actually hitting most, right? So we are just above the equator and is surrounded by warm water at about 28 degrees centigrade. These waters powers the storms, which brings about, we know that the average storm or typhoon that we have in the country is about 20 typhoons in a year, or about 22 as an average. So we have a lot of coastal homes. When we say coastal, these are areas nearby the ocean, nearby the water. Okay, be it a lake, an ocean, or 'di ba, mga beaches. There are a lot. So may maraming nakatira sa areas na yon. So therefore, um, those who can be affected by typhoons, by surges, storm surges, tsunami if there are these individuals living in the coastal home. And about 60% of the population is actually living in the coastal areas. There are a lot also of areas of deforestation in the country. Mining, okay? Um, mining in the mountains. Actually, there are a lot of mountains that are, kumbaga, we consider na kalbo na, 'di ba? Deforested. Due to deforestation. So bare hillsides lead to mudslides, landslides that can kill people during typhoon. Um, it can clog waterways, and of course may result even to, for example, a cholera outbreak because of not so good water supply. Okay. So the Philippines also is in the Ring of Fire, which makes it experience more earthquakes and volcanic activity more frequently. There are underdevelopment, there are underdevelopment and poor population. So poor people setting in coastal areas have houses and dwellings made of flimsy materials that cannot actually withstand typhoon, storm surges, and of course inadequate evacuation plans in the Philippines also contributes to the number of people that can be affected by these disasters. So, major disasters and calamities in the Philippines. Can you think of different major disasters and calamities in the Philippines? So, try to think on your own. Okay? Think about at least five. So, first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. What do you think? Okay. So with that five that you have thought of as actual disasters that usually happens in the Philippines, of course we have to still be resilient and cope with it. We've discussed earlier what to do in to manage either physical infrastructure and emotional uh, responses to the disaster. So nationally, the NDRRMC, or the National Risk Reduction and Management Council, is the agency in the country that is tasked to prepare for and respond to natural calamities. And it also uses strategies to mitigate the impact of disasters and increase the resiliency of both the national government and the local government units in the face of disasters. So, who is in charge of disasters in the Philippines? So, we've said earlier in the previous slide that it is the NDRRMC. It actually consists of three stages that can sometimes overlap. So, it may have the stage one, stage two, and stage three. By the way, uh, NDRM, NDRRMC were institutionalized, or were have started from 2010, where the Republic Act 10121, again 10121, have been enacted. Okay, so it's actually an act strengthening the Philippine disaster risk reduction and management system, promoting for the national risk reduction and management framework, and institutionalizing the national risk reduction and management plan, appropriating funds therefore and for other purposes. So Then on they are called as NDRRMC. Okay. So the stages, as I have mentioned. So for the stage one, it is a pre-disaster risk assessment action. So plans and controls, or simply put, emergency response preparedness are the task of it. So first stage alone involves many government departments and agencies like the Office of the Civil Defense, the Social Welfare and Development Office, Department of Interior and Local Government, DILG, and the representatives from more government departments. For the stage two, so the second stage involves response cluster and incident management teams, or the IMT. This happens, or the IMT, for instance, our agencies involved in the response clusters are the Armed Forces of the Philippines, Health Department, or the ones that you can see mostly working today in today's pandemic. The AFP, DOH, DSWD, the Philippine National Police, the DFA in case of foreign assistance is needed, among others. So this happens during or when disaster hits. So the rallying of relief and response happens at this stage, and again, this stage involves several government agencies and departments. Management of resources and personnel is under the incident management teams, while mandate and technical expertise are under the response clusters, implying a clear and separate function of the team involves during disaster relief operations. So the third and final stage is the response cluster and the IMT demobilization and deactivation. This is the transition to recovery and rehabilitation, where response clusters slowly move out. Post-disaster activities happen at this stage, where response cluster actually perform the review. Okay, they usually review what have been uh, the performance about. So their operations and document the whole or actual operations. Lessons learned, they review it, and the best practices to help improve the policies then on. So that ends the discussion. The following are the references utilized for the discussion of the whole disaster management continuum. So thank you so much for listening. If you do have questions, type in that in the comment box below and we'll try to address later on. Thank you very much for listening.